Okay, so hello and welcome back to another Unity tutorial. In this one we'll be continuing with the RPG Systems tutorial series. In this video we're going to be starting work on the NPC. I said I'd probably be doing that like last video or the video before, but I didn't want to jump into it without refactoring the inventory, because one problem we would have hit is that if we interact with the NPC, it wouldn't have been able to reference our inventory unless we set it up in the NPC to have reference to the inventory scriptable object beforehand, but then we'd lock ourselves into only being able to do that. But it doesn't make sense to. It makes more sense to, put the inventory component on the player, split everything up into these separate components. And then when we interact with the NPC to do the vendor stuff, it basically says, get the item container of the thing we're speaking to, essentially. And if it doesn't have one, then perhaps, just don't allow us to do the conversation for the vendor, because obviously the player will have an inventory, but let's say you accidentally forgot to or something. You shouldn't be able to then open the vendor inventory because it wouldn't work. None of the code would work. It has to assume that you do have an item container. So we'll be setting that up in this video. We'll create a simple window like user interface for this. We can make it look nicer later, or you guys can make a nicer looking one, but it's going to just display like the NPC's name and stuff like that and their data, and then it's also going to display the list of their occupations. So we're going to have to make like an occupation class, and based on their occupations we can interact differently. So that like the vendor occupation is going to need reference to an item container, so obviously we're going to drag in their inventory component, and that allows us to then speak to the vendor. It knows it's a vendor, and then we can click on the button, for like open their shop or something. And then when we decide to make some more NPC occupations like quest giver or dialogue person, to have a conversation with, we can then just add those to it, just keep adding components. It's going to be really well designed. We're going to keep it modular and separated. If we ever have to do refactoring, obviously I'll do that on here so you guys see it, and if you ever need help with that kind of stuff, the code is down below so you can compare it to mine. But yeah, let's get into the video. But of course, first I've got to thank the people who help support me in keeping this regular content coming, with special thanks to Flow State Games, Average Morning, Buddha, Thomas Huster, Remy Baldwin, and Phil Baum. If you want to help me out on Patreon, the link is down below. Otherwise, there are links to social media down below, so my Twitch, Twitter, and Discord, and maybe more. Go check those out, it'd mean a lot. But apart from that, let's get into the video. Okay, so I just thought I'd mention this video is going to be split up into two parts probably. This video, which is going to set up some of the code for having like occupations and the vendor code, and maybe another one. We'll probably stick to vendor, but we could also add like the dialogue thing. We won't do the logic for dialogue, but we can start doing the logic for the vendor, and we'll obviously create like the NPC interactable and start adding some data for that, and we'll just set up the code, I guess. And then next video can be more concerned about the UI, where we can actually spawn like buttons in dependent on the occupation, so we can create like a pool of buttons that get reused whenever we speak to a new NPC, because there's no need, even though we could just like instantiate a button prefab and initialize it and destroy it, but that creates garbage, which is the technical term, which is basically like memory that needs to be deallocated, and it makes more sense to just create the memory and then like hold on to it and reuse it rather than creating and destroying it, because it can actually lag your game, like not like tremendously unless you are doing it all the time. It's the same when you're spawning hundreds of projectiles. You want to reuse them rather than deleting them. If you have like a gun game with shooting projectiles, every time you've done with a projectile, add it back to a pool of deactivated ones. We want to do that with buttons. So whenever we close the NPC thing, we'll deactivate those buttons and add them back to a queue of buttons essentially, and then, or like a list, it can be anything really, and we'll basically reuse the buttons and reinitialize them rather than destroying them. It makes more sense. So we'll be doing that in the next video. For this video it'll be code under the hood, and then next video UI, because if we started doing the UI now it would just not have any interaction. So let's start off by creating a folder in scripts for NPCs. Okay, and we'll create an NPCs folder, and we'll create some classes, and I'll go set up the boilerplate code off camera. So we want to create an NPC class. This is a mono behavior that sits on an NPC. Then we're going to create a folder for occupations, so because we have quite a few of them, occupations, and inside occupations, whoops, what? Don't know why that went back. We want to create an interface for what an occupation is, so occupation, and then we're going to create some actual occupations. So we're going to have a class for a vendor. we're going to stick to vendor this video. I don't want to bother starting another script and then just leave it. So we're just going to assume vendor is the only occupation you can have right now. So go and open up the code in your editor of choice and just set up the boilerplate code like the namespace and I'm going to quickly mention so you guys can try do it yourself on your own. The NPC is a mono behavior that is interactable. So it implements interactable. The vendor is a mono behavior that implements ioccupation, and an occupation is an interface. Okay, you don't really need to bother setting up the methods right now because I'm going to do that with you on camera, but just try setting up the boilerplate code for each of the classes and the interface. So I'll be back with you in a minute. Okay, so I think I've set everything up correctly. We have the NPC class that is in dapidino.npcs. It's the NPC class, it's a mono behavior, it sits on an object, and it's interactable. So we're going to write the code here for what happens when we interact with it. Next video, we're going to make this handle the UI calling, but for this video, we're just going to debug log some stuff. Then occupation, we're going to basically define what does an occupation have, and then it's an interface, obviously, and it's in npc.occupations. I put it in the other folder. And then the vendor is also in the occupations folder, and it implements ioccupation because it is an occupation. So now we're going to start off in NPC, and it's like, well, what kind of data does an NPC have, right? Well, an NPC, they always have names, right? Every NPC has a name, so I'm going to private new string name, new NPC name or something. Just keep in mind, you might have your NPC in multiple, stages of your game. You might have a main character that you see in the tutorial starting area, and you also see them, really late on in the game. And you don't really want to use the same prefab for that because a lot might have changed. Their visuals might have changed and their logic might have changed of some kind and so on. Maybe even their name changed if they gained a title throughout. I don't know what your RPG is about, but you get the point. So what you want to do is you want to store instance-specific stuff on the mono behavior, so things that can change from, NPC to NPC. So if your guy, the same NPCs in multiple places, whatever data does change, such as, their actual occupations, in different areas of the game, they might sell you different things and have different dialogue. You want to go put that in the mono behavior. But anything that is static, such as their actual name, might stay the same, right? You might get a new title, but I'd say the name's going to stay the same. Might be Bob, Bill, Barry, whatever. Their greeting text might change. So whatever things, it's up to you where you put the data. But we, in the future, in the next video afterwards, we might eventually make a scriptable object for the NPC static data, just like you would for item classes for static data, because you're going to have different instances of your items, right? You might have an iron sword with 10 durability and an iron sword with 15. They're still the same template item that you essentially clone or duplicate, instantiate. But they still have the same root behavior and logic, just like how the NPCs, you don't want to have to go around different versions of the same guy changing his name if his name changes, right? If you decide to call Bill, Bob, Barry, if you decide to rename one of them, Bill is now Bob, then you would rather just change it in one place on the scriptable object that they all share, rather than going through each of the different prefabs renaming it, if you get what I mean. So I hope you understand why we might do that, but for now we're just going to stick it in here. It's just a thing to keep in mind in the future. Let's set some greeting text. So I think I spelled that right. Oh well. So the name is, new NPC name, hello adventurer. And when we interact with them, for now, we just want to say debug.log. My name is name. Well, how about we do? Greeting text. And make sure that says greeting text. Greeting text. So it says hello adventurer, comma. My name is name. Okay, now we're going to change that, but that's just the default, right? So if we now go and attach this NPC to someone. So let's go make another empty game object. Actually, no, let's make it a capsule. Put it at a height of 1, and then we'll just go shove it over here so it can be at -3, 0 or something. Wait, 3? Where is he gone? Oh, I put it at 3, yeah, instead of -3. Okay. He's got a capsule collider, and he's going to now be an NPC, right? He's an NPC. New NPC name, Bob. Save. I'll rename it in the hierarchy in a second, but essentially we've got Bob, and when we go and interact with Bob, hello adventurer, my name is Bob. I guess if I put an exclamation mark there, it doesn't really make sense to then have a, you know, it doesn't matter, that's just some random text I put in. We are going to display it differently. We could even do it so it says name, colon, greeting text. So it's almost like a conversation, you know, it says like who said it and what did they say. Bob, hello adventure. Okay, so we're going to call this test underscore NPC, and we're going to call this test underscore item pickup. So now if we interact with Bob, it's going to say, whoops, it's going to say in the console, Bob, hello adventurer. Okay, Bob's going to want to sell us some items, for example. So an occupation is going to need a name, such as vendor or whatever, right? So we're going to say string name get. We want to be able to get a name string from the vendor. So it's telling us there's a problem. So we're going to say public string name returns the name. So for vendor, for now we can just say like vendor, right? We could just return the class name, but later on we might want to change that, or maybe even want to say like trade, right? Or like let's trade. So let's just say that was the like, you know, it's always going to be just let's trade or something. We could then say when we interact with him, here's the stuff, and then we can say for. Okay, now here's the problem. We don't have access to a vendor thing because, as far as we know, we might be a vendor, we might not be. So we need to like save essentially or load whatever their occupations are. So we're gonna say occupations dot length. Now we don't know what occupations is, so we're gonna need a list of occupations, right? So we're gonna say serialized field private I occupation array occupations equals new occupation array. Now some of you clever people might have spotted a problem with this, and I'll do it on purpose. I'll make it wrong on purpose and show you what happens. But if you don't know, because we've used an interface and the same thing that happens when you use an abstract class, Unity doesn't serialize them. So if we go back to the NPC and we add a vendor component, well, we can't even drag it in. There's no field to drag it in, even though we exposed an array of occupation. And that's because they just don't implement, they don't serialize abstract classes or interfaces. They have the power to do so, they just don't. Now, there's probably some reason why they don't, but there is an add-on I use quite often called Odin Inspector that does serialize it, so I could go and drag in the occupations and do quite a few other fancy things. It's a paid add-on, Odin Inspector. Some of you might have it, some of you won't. But I'm designing these tutorials around people who don't have any paid assets. So, because it's the only paid asset I actually own, it's really useful. But I'm not sponsored by them or anything. I'm just saying, like, I'm showing you how to do things in a way that doesn't use, extra add-ons. So normally I might just drag them in and, order it in the way I want. Now, when it comes to calling get components in Unity, as far as I'm aware, and from what I've seen in the past, it does it in order. So as long as you kind of order your occupations in the order you want them to appear on the UI, it will work just fine. So we want to actually keep it as just a private array, like so. And then on the start, so as soon as the NPC exists in the scene, he's going to get them. Now, even though we can't assign them in the inspector because they're all different types, we can actually do it in code. Apparently, it works anyway. So occupations equals get components of type I occupation. So it's going to loop over the object itself. It's going to loop over here and basically say any class that implements I occupation, add it to this array. Okay. So we will have an array when we do that. And then when we interact, we're going to say go through all the occupations and debug.log occupations I.name. Okay? And now what should happen is when we speak with Bob over here, wait, let me just put the console back. Bob, hello adventurer, let's trade. Okay, so now he's a vendor, he can trade. So we need to do a little bit more this video. We're not just going to end it here. We do want to get a bit more done before we worry about the UI. So it's nice and all, every occupation having a name, but if that's all they did, then they'd be pretty useless, right? So what we want to do is we want to write the code for a vendor here. So what I used to do back in my day when I was clueless, I would just write all of the possible code an NPC can do in the NPC class, which is a problem because when you want to change anything, you break other parts, and it's all horrible. That's why we're writing specific code for different parts of the NPC in different classes. So the NPC class doesn't even know what a vendor is, it just knows it's an occupation and it can have occupations. So as well as the name for the vendor, we also need an item container, right? An item container on itself to essentially represent like what items it has. So we're going to say we want a private item container. And just like earlier, we can't drag it in. We have to use get component because it's an interface, so it doesn't let you assign in the inspector. So we're going to say item container equals null. And on start, item container is equal to get component item container, or item container. It's telling us the problem. We don't know what it is, so import it. Let's just say, here we go, we've got our item container. Though the NPC doesn't know about that, right? This class knows, oh, I've got my item container now, but that doesn't mean that the NPC class can do anything with it. Now, ideally what we'll do is we'll end up raising an event so that the UI, or essentially alerting the UI saying, hey, we started this, here's the thing. So what we will end up doing is we'll have a NPC UI class that listens for a iOccupation event being raised, and when it hears the iOccupation event, it'll then interpret it saying, depending on what type of thing it is, we'll do something different. Either that, or on the actual occupations themselves, they can store the events they raise so that the vendor can essentially open a vendor window, and the dialogue could open a dialogue window, and so on. Now, we'll worry about the UI interpretation later. For now, we just want to say, perhaps, what items this vendor has, right? In the debug console, we want to know what items they have. Currently, we just say, we say the name of the occupation. So I wanted then to say, maybe after that, debug.log occupations let's make a data string that just displays some data about the occupation. So string data get. Obviously, we can build that string however we want to. So what we want to do in here to build that string, so we'll do it here, public string data. So let's just say return empty string for now. We want to return the, item container dot. Okay, we haven't apparently in the item container interface. Yeah, we haven't put a function in here for getting a slot at index, but we've already written it. So I'm going to say item slot get slot by index index. So we can pass an index and get slot data back. And if I go over to the inventory, we already have it here. I'm going to actually move it though. Cool. Return item container dot get slot by index 0 dot item dot name. Okay. I guess one problem with this though is the item in a slot could be null. So all we want to really display is all the items that aren't null, right? So we want to say item container dot, let's say, get all items. So this could be a list of type item a list of item get all items. Now this is a pretty silly function just for now. I don't think this class should be in part of hotbars anymore. Dapperdino.items. No, it's fine. So we want to write in the inventory how to get all items. So it's just going to be a simple function. We'll do it under the add, I guess. Maybe under remove as well. Okay. Public list of type item. Get all items. We're just going to say make a list, if we tell it what a list is. Make a list of item called items equals new list of type item. And we're just going to say for all item slots dot length, if item slots I dot item is not null, then items dot add item slots I dot item. And then right at the end, we can just return that list. So we return the list of items. So there we get all items. So now we're going to say dot get all items. So we've got all these items, and then we'll just say string item names is equal to new string for in I is less than items dot count. So we're going to loop for all the items and then say item names plus equals items I dot name. And then return the item names at the end. So now when we ask for the data from the vendor, it's going to say, all right, let's get all the items from our container and say what we have. Now, ideally, you'd also show like the quantity as well, but I can't be bothered with that. That's a bit too much. Apparently, yeah, we don't need the hotbars anymore. We just need the normal items class namespace. That's just because I didn't realize that I'd changed the namespace in a previous video. I hadn't updated the item class apparently. They're all going to be fixed in a second, don't you worry. Alright, they should all be fixed now, I think. And it means that we can go to the NPC and tell it, you're an NPC, you're a vendor, and you have an inventory. And we don't have to link anything up because it's all done in code. The only problem is now, we don't actually have a way of setting items. So if I go over to here, we don't have any items, right? So ideally, if I go to the inventory, we'll just set it. We'll make the items array. And where is it? Well, I'm looking in the wrong class. The inventory is currently a private array of items. Why don't we just make it a serialized field private array? Because this isn't on a scriptable object, so we don't have to worry about it getting saved incorrectly. We can just set it ourselves here. And it also means, actually, we don't really need a size field. So we don't need to start with the size. We don't need a size variable, which is quite handy, because now we can just set the size in here. So I'm going to say, all right, this NPC has a size 20 inventory, and perhaps in the first slot it has a health potion and it has 3 of them. Okay, now obviously the quantity doesn't matter really. And then on the player, again, yeah, we have 20 inventory slots, right? And we just kind of override and say, yeah, that's the player's default inventory. Maybe you want the player to have a different default inventory, right? Maybe you want the player to have some starting items. You could set that in there for the prefab. But let's go over here and press E. And now it says over here, let's trade item, consumable, health potion, comma, right? So if I go back to the NPC and give it, I mean, I don't have any other types of items, so I'm not going to waste time here making more. You can make more, but I'm going to add 3 in different places, right? So now it should say item underscore consumable underscore health potion, or consumable health potion, whatever, multiple times. So obviously there it says that, comma, that, comma, that. So yeah, that's it for this video. Now we have NPCs that can store their items, and they can, you know, have their starting items, which is what they're going to be able to trade essentially. And then when we go on to implement saving, we can actually then save those slots. So the NPCs, whatever you've bought from them is actually saved to file. Now maybe you want to implement a system where every so often it restocks, and obviously you can do that if you want to, but I'm going to just have it so we set the NPC's items at the start, and then once you've bought from them, that's essentially gone from their inventory. I'll have a think about it, how I want to implement it, but that's how we're going to do it for now. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned, follow the playlist for the next videos, subscribe obviously to be notified, click the bell icon if you want to be definitely notified. Obviously support through social media down below would be greatly appreciated. But apart from that, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.